Unabashed.
The most unpredictable.
Becomes a headline.
The most volatile.
Outrageous behavior.
Unsubstantiated narratives. A battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your host, Milan of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. On Sunday night, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Donald Trump addressed a crowd of 50,000 Indian Americans at NRG Stadium in Houston, Texas. The event, dubbed Howdy Modi, was billed as the largest address by a foreign leader, whose name is not the Pope, on American soil. It had music, it had dancing, it had speeches by a variety of elected American politicians, not least the President of the United States, and it was capped off by a 50-minute address by Modi to a largely adoring crowd. To discuss this and much more on this week's podcast, I'm joined by podcast regulars Sadanand Dhume of the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal, and Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Friends, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back.
Howdy, Milan.
Saying howdy Modi really fast, like 10 times fast, is hard.
Yeah, but you're a Texan. You should have that kind of pat down.
So later in the show, we're going to discuss the situation in Kashmir and the Modi government's response to a flagging Indian economy. But we have to start with a discussion of Howdy Modi. Tanvi, let me start with you on the optics. So what, to your mind, is the sort of broader significance of this historic rally that took place in Houston over the weekend? You know, critics on the one hand say it was a publicity stunt. Supporters say it's a historic inflection point. How would you characterize it?
I mean, I'm a bit old-fashioned in the sense that I like to look at patterns, and moments are really important. And I think this was an important moment. It was a historic moment. And I think I said on Twitter, and I'll say that again, it will go down in the annals of U.S.-India relations as a historic moment. Now, is it an inflection point? I think we'll only be able to tell that kind of a few months from now. And perhaps even kind of a week from now. I think, in fact, what's ongoing or about to happen as we record this, the meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi, that could be an inflection point, depending on the results that come out of it. The upcoming quadrilateral foreign ministers meeting could be an inflection point. But I think nonetheless, this was significant, and it was significant for a couple of different reasons, I think. I mean, for one, I think, yes, it was, as people have pointed out, a recognition of the Indian American community. And that term is rather loosely used. I mean, obviously, there were Indian Americans, green card holders, but also non-resident Indians who were Indian citizens. Regardless, it was a recognition of the community. It was, for Prime Minister Modi, including to his audience back home, the pulling power. And I think especially with kind of, the economic news coming out of India has been kind of the mood's been gloomy. So I can imagine for him to come out and kind of pull this off, not just with kind of 50-odd thousand people, though Trump said 59,000 yesterday, but also to have the President of the United States, whatever you think of the man himself, but to have the President of the United States and members of Congress there would have been kind of a good sign. I think the second thing where it's significant is, people have said, this shows that Indian American community is right. Let's be clear. This is because people think of India as important / useful. And I think that's a reminder and should be a reminder that that is what people need to focus on, that the strategic and economic reasons for the relationship need to be nurtured, need to be kept in mind. And not just, yes, the community is very important. Yes, people pay lip service to values, and it is also important. But those underlying factors are really important and have to be nurtured.
So, Sadanand, up until about 2 weeks ago, this was a Modi event. And I want to ask you about the last-minute decision of the U.S. president to attend this rally, supposedly at the invitation of the Indian side. What was in it for the president, and what do you think he got out of it?
Well, it was still very much a Modi event, despite the fact that you had Trump over there also doing his star turn. It's not clear to me how much he got out of it, right? I mean, there's the most sort of, obvious view, which is not very flattering to the president, which is that, look, he saw this the idea of a stadium filled with 50,000 people was just impossible to resist.
It's like, ooh, me too.
Exactly. So that's but beyond that, I guess maybe a few things. I mean, the first is that he really bristles at the idea that, his critics call him racist, and I think it sort of certainly helps him point out that maybe that's not the case, because there he is in a stadium filled with 50,000 brown people cheering. it helps him make the distinction between legal and illegal immigrants, which I think often is not made in sort of the broader Trumpian movement quite as accurately. But here he can actually sort of credibly made the argument that, look, I'm not against all immigrants. I'm fine with immigrants like you. It's just another kind of immigrant that I'm not. So whether you want to buy it or not is a different issue. But it did make him allow him to make that distinction. And then the third, which I think is sort of perhaps the least important, but it has been given some press, is the idea that, Texas may be, moving from being a red state to becoming more purple. And I mean, Milan, you know much more about this than I do. And that possibly the Indian American community in Texas are potentially swing voters who, and Trump wants to keep an eye on them. And that's certainly a possibility, but I would put that as kind of low down.
I want to ask you both about the Prime Minister's remarks. He covered a lot of ground in his speech, from kind of the commitment to diversity at home to a justification of the abrogation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir to Pakistan, to, immigration. Tanvi, let me ask you first, what were your biggest takeaways on the Prime Minister's address?
I mean, I know what President Trump's big takeaway was, and to quote him, the very aggressive statement that Prime Minister Modi made on kind of Kashmir. I think, I don't know if, I think it was definitely assertive. And one of the things is the way he made the case, and he took it head on. And I suspect partly he took it head on because that was a crowd which expected to hear about it, but also he probably, my sense is, I don't think he's going to want to bring it up at the his UN General Assembly speech. But I think it was kind of, in some ways, bringing it up, knowing that the president, I think he would have brought it up anyway, but with the president there, and perhaps we'll talk about this later, kind of sending a signal, and the message, kind of getting seeking from the crowd a standing ovation from for kind of Indian MPs. And I think this was a way of saying, look, this went through parliamentary. This was not just done by diktat. Now, you can argue about that. But regardless, the point that he was trying to make, that, look, this went in through a democratic process. I think the second kind of takeaway from not necessarily, I think it was from his remarks, but the whole event in some ways is that, the fact we've talked about, the last 2 decades, you've seen evolution and mostly forward movement in U.S.-India relations. But Modi, since he's come to office, we saw a little bit of a dip in this, but it's gone back to it, which is fully embracing the U.S. relationship. Now, one can point out that he was fully embracing Putin a few weeks ago at the Eastern Economic Forum. And I don't know that he'll embrace Xi, but reportedly he will at least host him in India. So I think, that aspect of the U.S.-India relationship. So for me, the 2 big takeaways was, yes, this kind of bringing up Kashmir, taking it on head on as an issue. And then second, kind of this other aspect. The other thing that strikes me is things that were not mentioned as much, which is you've seen a shift from his speeches in 2014 to his subsequent speeches in 2017 and this one. 2014, he was saying, dear Indian diaspora, this is the 5 things you need to do for India. Now he makes the point that their biggest contribution to U.S.-India relations in India can be by being good Americans or kind of Indian residents in America.
Sadanand, what jumped out to you from the speech?
Most definitely Kashmir, because you had the Prime Minister not just not ignoring it, but instead of playing defense, deciding to play offense on this. And it seems to me that the strategy is to basically impress in this very kind of basic primal way the fact that his action is extremely popular in India, and you can see that demonstrated in the popularity it enjoyed in that stadium. And so that, at a time when the vast majority of media coverage in the West has been extremely negative and sort of questioned the Indian move, to just sort of let the president and let the members of Congress over there know that, look, there is another narrative out there too, and this is an extremely popular move. So I think that was, clearly the biggest takeaway. And the second thing, which I thought he did quite cleverly, was, he spoke twice, but the first time when he spoke in English and he really laid it on thick, flattery central. And you could make fun of that, but I think that in some ways
Session
it
sponsored
showed
by Amul Butter.
exactly. It in a way, I thought that was kind of from the point of view of Indian diplomacy, that was refreshing because it showed a practicality, that you kind of know who your target audience is and you do what needs to be done, as opposed to the old traditional starchy Indian, here are 5 reasons why I love strategic autonomy model.
Thank God we didn't get that speech.
I will say though, I mean, there is one thing that he said in those remarks, and I think he's followed the playbook that Abe has, Macron has, etc., which is laid on thick, right? And it's paid dividends in some ways. But I think the thing that there's a question about is whether. Now, he was talking about Ab Ki Baar, Trump's Sarkar from the previous election, but the fact that he used campaign slogans, Make America Great Again, etc., he's used versions of that. But given that we're about to head in an election year here, I think, I wish that they had left that out of. I understood why he did it, and he stopped short of an endorsement while saying enough for Trump to believe that he endorsed him. But I do think there's a reason India has tended to be very careful about walking that line. Now, in one way, you could say what Sadanand did, that this is the new India. They're going to say, and they figure that, look, the Democrats still have strategic, economic, values, reasons.
But I actually agree with you, because I think that what he was trying to walk a very fine line, and I don't think you can walk that line that finely. And once you introduce the slogan, right, Ab Ki Baar Trump Sarkar, even though he did it looking backwards, which literally translates as this time a Trump government, it's a little bit too cute to suggest that, well, I was just talking about something he said 4 years ago.
And I think this is somewhere, India often, and particularly people on the right will often in India will look to Israel as an example. And I think this is something they can learn from the Israel example, or the Bibi example in the US, which is he has somehow managed in the last few years, by being fairly partisan, to make Israel for after a long time a kind of a partisan relationship here. It's still, it's still a healthy relationship in many ways, but still, India would do well to kind of stay away from that.
So I want to turn to our second topic now, because it's something both of you touched on, which is Jammu and Kashmir. It's been more than 50 days since the abrogation or the scrapping of Article 370. The information blackout has been partially, though not fully, lifted. The political opposition still remains under house arrest. This past week, a member of the Modi cabinet said, those under house arrest should not be complaining because they are residing in quote-unquote 5-star guest houses and have access to luxury items, apparently, like brown bread and Bollywood films. Sadanand, should we be concerned that, a month and a half after August 5th, the political opposition is still under lock and key?
Yeah, and first of all, the idea that they are predominantly under house arrest is simply not accurate. There are a few high-profile leaders, such as Mehbooba Mufti and Farooq Abdullah and Omar Abdullah, who are being plied with the world's greatest luxuries, namely brown bread and old cassettes of Hollywood movies.
And access to gym equipment.
And access to gym equipment. Can you imagine? Right, the lap of luxury. But let's face it, there are many, many more people who are being held in jails. They've been flown to other parts of India. There are credible reports that suggest that this includes children. Many of the people being held are members of civil society, businessmen, people who have nothing to do with politics. And ironically, many of them are people who have literally put their lives on the line for many years by batting for India. So the sort of comments that you're mentioning about how this is also gentle and no one should be complaining are just, frankly, ludicrous. As for the communications lockdown, the most important parts have not been lifted. What we're talking about is the valley, and people in the valley do not have access to mobile phones, and they do not have access to the internet. So sure, then other parts of the state, people where this move was less unpopular, they do have they have had their mobile phones restored and so on. But the situation in the valley, which is really the heart of the dispute, is by all accounts, still quite dire.
Let me push you a little bit on this because, we've all met a number of Government of India officials and have seen their speeches and their statements and read their op-eds. In fact, the foreign minister has a piece in today's Financial Times. We're recording on Tuesday morning, September 24th. And the point there is that, a lot of the foreign media attention is on the Valley, but the Valley is a very small component of the overall state, and it's one where they're worried about violence, where they're worried about unrest, they're worried about separatism, and so it may take longer for the government justifiably to unwind this lockout.
But Milan, it's not a small part of the state. It's only a small part of the state if you completely ignore the people. It's the most populous part of the state. You don't measure what is large and what is small by area. Right? You measure it by human beings. And I think that's really been the principal weakness in these arguments put forward, including the argument put forward by Foreign Minister Jaishankar and the FT, is that to buy it, you just have to basically ignore the fact that there are 8 million Kashmiri Muslims in the Valley who are unhappy and who are being sort of essentially have been robbed of what in 2019 are pretty basic rights, like the ability to get onto the internet and be able to use a cell phone.
So I want to come to you, Tanvi, on the international response, because in my view, the criticism from abroad has been fairly muted. Now that Trump and Modi have shared a stage together, as you mentioned, do you think India's stand in J&K has essentially been given the kind of good housekeeping seal of approval as far as the U.S. government is concerned?
I think the Indian government will see it that way, and they wouldn't be wrong to necessarily. You've had an unprecedented moment in U.S.-India relations, and so they will see it that way. Having said that, you do see, and listen, I'm a cynic about these things. I am not surprised that the global reaction has been, as you said, has not been critical. At least, global government's reaction, because they will judge. They'll see is this country strategically or economically useful to me, and that's what they will judge it on. We can talk about values all we want, but let's be clear, that's what countries judge. Even the Europeans have been relatively muted. Having said that, the fact that you have seen the Indian ambassador write an response. I don't think it was an op-ed. I think it was an op-ed / response to the kind of Imran Khan op-ed in an American newspaper. And you've seen the foreign minister write a piece in the FT the week of Anga. Tells you that they are hearing privately from a number of these governments that this is something that they find, to quote a word we often hear Republicans use in this country, is troubling. And I think there is a recognition to some extent also that, listen, one of the strengths India has is that it's not China. And it's not China, and that's a democracy that follows the rule of law, has respect for kind of people's wishes, etc. And I think whether or not that will be publicly admitted, there's probably recognition. I think there's a third thing that does matter, which is that India is having to call in a bunch of chips from these countries. And that means that these are chips that I cannot... You could say, fine, Indians will say, as Sadanand said, many Indians, this is a very popular move, they say it's worth it if we can cash in those chips we've earned over time. The question is, what happens when you need those chips down the line for something else? And so when you're calling in those favors to say, I need your backing on this, you might not have as much backing, or you have to put something else on the table down the line to kind of make sure that you are kind of keeping your favor box full, so to speak.
Sadanand, you speak with a lot of people in the BJP, and I'm wondering what you think their end game is here. How do they expect to translate the current turmoil or clampdown or whatever you want to call it into the political and developmental success that it says the state will be over time?
I don't think that's the goal at all. I think that what they've done over the last 5 years is leverage Kashmir and leverage troubles in Kashmir to benefit in the rest of the country. So this is really not about, in my estimation, and has not been about what happens with the Kashmiris. But if we're sort of, blunt about it, this is about winning elections in the rest of the country. There's also an ideological element. As you know, the BJP, going back to the 1950s, in its previous incarnation as the Bharatiya Janasangh, has long sort of viewed this as, and they've been, to their credit, they've been forthright about this. They've long viewed this as a sort of example of kind of special rights being given to Muslims and how they're being pampered, and they have a point of view. They've never been apologetic about it, and I think this sort of talk about, this is really because we love LGBT rights so much, and we can't wait to turn the Kashmiri economy into Singapore. This is for external consumption, let's be honest.
Or reservations, for that matter.
Right. So these are a bunch of post facto lawyerly justifications. That is not what animates the people who are, that does not animate the party, and it certainly doesn't animate the average person on the street who is for this.
So there's a question of how do you get the J&K economy started. There's a question of how you get the Indian economy started. The government now, through a series of basically weekly press conferences by the finance minister, has unveiled a number of measures to try to counteract the current slowdown, which I think they have now acknowledged is both cyclical and has a structural component. Most recent move was the finance minister's announcement of a slashing of the corporate tax rate. Sadanand, you have been a votary of this move for many years now. 4 or 5 weeks ago, when we were all together at this table, you talked about this. Does the government deserve credit for bringing corporate tax rates in line with that of some of its international competitors?
Well, I can only assume that Nirmala Sitharaman was listening to your podcast.
That's right.
and that's why she did it.
This is think tank impact.
Right. But look, this is something that they had promised in 2015. And Jaitley had promised it in a budget. India's corporate tax rates are much higher than most of its competitors in East Asia. So I think this is a good move. It remains to be seen. If you're an optimist, then you can see this as some kind of turning point where finally the government acknowledges that the way they've been approaching the economy has been wrong. They've been too statist. They've been too mistrustful of business. They have been too heavy-handed in getting tax authorities to kind of go after both businesses and individuals. My own view is that the jury is still out, because it seems to me that over the last few weeks, the finance minister has essentially been acting in panic because she delivered a budget that was extremely poorly received. Sort of people have called it either the worst or the second worst budget since reforms in 1991. And she realizes that many foreign investors have been heading for the exits. And also the things had reached a point where even BJP supporters, who can very often be counted on to cheer the most absurd things, and I'm not going to use my favorite example over here, were quite upset by her so-called super rich tax and so on. So there's been a sort of a realization. Just how much of a course correction this is, it's too early to say. Are they just doing tax cuts and then are they leaving it at that? Then I don't think they're going to get very far. But if the tax cuts are the first move and they're going to do a lot of other reforms, land, labor, privatization, and so on, things that we've been talking about for many years, then I think this is something worth welcoming.
Let me just stay with you on this, because in your last Wall Street Journal column, you write that Modi has held 4 U.S. rallies in 5 years, but he still doesn't seem to grasp how freedom feeds prosperity in the United States. By extension of your argument, the Prime Minister himself is perhaps not convinced of the need to do some of these things that you just rattled off.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've written about before too. It drives me nuts. I mean, basically you have, Modi showing up in the U.S. and looking at this prosperous community. And there's a tendency both in political circles and in the media to sort of view this simply as, the greatness of Indians. Look at these people, and they have this, they're so magically talented and so wonderful. And look at how many doctors, and look at the per capita income and so on, and not taking anything away from the Indian American community. I think that it's sort of, it's absurd to ignore the fact that many people are in fact economic refugees. And the reason why people have moved in large numbers to this country was that India, frankly, made a hash of things. And if that was more acknowledged, then I think that what Modi would be trying to do would be trying to the degree possible, recreate the economic conditions. Obviously, he can't make it exactly the same, but move in a direction towards economic freedom so people can achieve their potential. And we have seen virtually no signs of that over the past 5 years.
So, Tanvi, I want to ask you about sentiment. We've seen thus far, we're not all the way through, but a positive trip to the United States from Modi. Rumors swirling about an impending bilateral trade deal and the tax cut announcement, of course. Do you think taken together, these have the potential, at least as far as foreign investors, multinationals, U.S. companies are concerned, to give them a newfound kind of jolt of confidence in the economy?
I mean, I think it comes down to something Sadanand said, but also I think Sanjay Baru had a good article about this, which it depends on. There's a bit of announcement fatigue amongst a number of people we talk to here or in New York or California. And the idea, and I've heard it in Europe as well recently, and in places like Japan as well, which is that, we've heard a lot of announcements. And there's the implementation bit and the follow-through bit. Is this it's a pattern or is it a moment? And I think the question, and I think Sanjay Baru pointed this out, is this just a moment, a one-time thing? Or is this a realization, as there was in kind of previous significant moments, that the government understands this can't just be a one-time thing, a quick fix, or a few quick fixes, that it says something about them. I think they have acknowledged that there's a problem, no matter what is said publicly, but also that acknowledging that the fixes that are required would require a whole different way of thinking than we have seen in the past few years. And not just the things that Sadanand mentioned, but also the issue of India's economic approach to the world, which means trade and investment. Now, as you said, we're hearing these rumors. By the time I suspect this gets uploaded, we will know whether the US and India have actually got to a trade deal or an agreement or, but if you hear an announcement that, look, they're starting talks at the FTA, you'll have some that say this is a good move. There'll be others who say, well, India's been negotiating an FTA with the EU for kind of years and it's got nowhere. So I think if people see that this is a serious effort and a change in thinking and understanding of what's required, then yes, you will see. I think there'll be a bump. I mean, we saw this in the Indian stock market. And I think if there's kind of some understanding between Trump and Modi, we'll see a little bit more. But I think for it to be sustained, people will have to see kind of a more consistent, sustained change.
Let me go out on a limb and make a quick prediction here. I think what you're going to see on the trade side is actually quite similar to what you've seen in the last few weeks in terms of economic announcements, which is essentially damage control. Now, the two countries have allowed the trade relationship to deteriorate quite dramatically. In May, the U.S. ended India's GSP preferences, which is a program that allowed many Indian labor-intensive manufacturers to export to the U.S. without any tariffs. Now, I think and then India had raised tariffs on many U.S. products, including almonds and walnuts. And I think what you're going to see essentially is that some of that is going to be rolled back. You may see a few other things here and there, like India may, reduce its tariffs on Harley Davidsons. There are hardly any Harley Davidsons sold in India, so it doesn't really matter. But it gives the president something to boast about.
People have talked about price caps on medical devices,
right? And they might come up with a few. So these are kind of minor things, right? I do not think that. For larger reasons, right? I think as the whole world is going through this moment where we are rethinking the approach to trade, including Trump, right? His speech today at the UN, he is clearly not a globalist. He has very sort of definitive views about trade. So I don't think you're going to get something dramatic. What you're going to get is the equivalent of them slaying a lizard and calling it a dragon.
Well, I think fundamentally the two countries, and I think we're in this particular moment where kind of economic philosophies potentially clash, where you heard this kind of contradiction in the speeches that President Trump gave in Houston and Prime Minister Modi gave on Independence Day, where you had President Trump saying in a speech that was otherwise kind of fairly positive, highlighting achievements, I want you to buy more American products and services, you India. And Prime Minister Modi speech on August 15 said, look, Indians, I want you to buy more Indian products. And so this thing, and these days, that's what everybody seems to be saying, which is, or a number of countries seem to be saying, which is, I want to export more and import less. And I think that contradiction has to be sorted out. Until they don't, that is going to be a problem. Having said that, I think there are people on both sides. Now, whether their leadership listens to them or not is another matter, who understand that you can actually find compromises in a way that actually would be harder in the US-China context, but it means give on both sides. Whether or not that give is going to be given, we'll find out.
So, like we do every week, have to end the show by asking each of you to tell our listeners about a story coming out of India that they should be paying attention to, but perhaps have not been. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I think the most fascinating story out there is this whole language issue, where Amit Shah gave a speech where he talked about how it's time Hindi became the national language. He immediately faced extreme blowback, and then he had to kind of come back and revise his comments and sort of point out that he didn't really have a problem with any of many regional languages. And then we saw in Texas during Howdy Modi making it a point to speak various regional languages to emphasize the fact that India sees its various languages as a source of strength and a kind of pluralism to be proud of. I think this is an issue that is interesting because it's not going to go away, even though the government may have retreated, because at its core, you have the fact that Hindu nationalism as a movement has long been linked with Hindi nationalism, which we look at a lot less. So I think this is something to I'm not saying that they're going to do anything drastic, but I just think that this is something worth keeping an eye on.
Tanvi?
So mine is a little bit more technocratic, which is there was a report in the Indian Express, I think it was last week. I've lost track of time a little bit, but yes, it was last week, about the government potentially adjusting the higher education bill to allow foreign universities entry into India. Now, this has been, this was first proposed during the UPA. It's come back up, and it's related to, this has implications for the Indian economy, for potentially skilling, but also for kind of US-India relations. And so it'll be interesting to see if this goes anywhere. And frankly, what they do with higher education in general. There is still the question of if you're going to you have to make sure once you've skilled and educated people that there are jobs out there. But this
jobs are in Texas.
The jobs are in Texas. But I think, people have pointed out, look, there are actually jobs. American companies, for example, have pointed out they can create jobs in India. Don't tell Trump. But, the skilling has been an issue. But regardless, that this potentially could actually open up a whole new area of opportunity. It's a controversial bill. The downsides, it's a draft. It's in, I think there's certain draft provisions. So we'll see where that goes. But I think that could be an interesting thing to watch.
So my nomination would be, there are elections coming up, guys. Aren't we excited? We've just, finished 2019, and now we have state elections coming up in Maharashtra and Haryana. The dates have been announced. The polling is going to take place on October 21st. Ostensibly, these are two states where the Congress could have a shot. I don't think they will win, but they are places where they have traditionally had an organization. There are many domestic governance issues at play in both places, whether it's farmer anger or law and order or safety, that if they had their act together could mobilize on. We're not seeing a ton of energy and excitement on the opposition side, although, as we've seen, a lot can happen through the course of a 2 or 3 week campaign. But we'll be back hopefully at the end of October to talk about what happened in those elections. Best week, worst week? Do we have responses other than Rahul Gandhi for worst week and Narendra Modi for best week?
Well, I would say that the best week was probably the overseas friends of the BJP and the whole kind of network of organizations, right? Because the amount of effort that would have gone into pulling off this event in Texas at a time where, it's a fraught time. The Kashmir the Kashmir decision was barely just about about 6 weeks ago. I think it shows a capacity for organization. So I'd say that they definitely had the best week. Now I had come up with a worst week thing, but I'm it slipped my mind. So why don't we let Tanvi go, and I'll come back to my worst week.
So my best and worst week are kind of related, which was, I think, the best week was for folks who love hyphenation, India-Pakistan hyphenation. And the worst week is those who very much supported dehyphenation. And I think, we have seen, whatever people say, the fact, I think that since the beginning of the year, we've seen kind of a linking of India-Pakistan, at least in the minds of policymakers. Now, is it having kind of the old-fashioned thing where everything that's done with India is measured against, will Pakistan be upset about it? I don't think we're there yet. I think there's still that idea of, if we're doing this with Pakistan, how will India think about this? But, the fact that even in the public imagination, after years of India being hyphenated with China, we're seeing, kind of going back to, we haven't seen this in a kind of more than a decade, but we're seeing it kind of go back. And whether all of you would have got kind of event speaking invites or kind of calls from local radio stations around the country, India-Pakistan in their mind is back.
I'd say my worst week is not just week, but worst 6 weeks or worst 2 months is the Indian Supreme Court. The fact that they have not been able to even hold hearings on something as fundamental as the abrogation of Article 370, which has been around for 70 years. The fact that they have not been able to even sort of talk about this is really, it speaks extremely poorly for the strength of the institution and its priorities.
Well, this is also a week in which we saw the wife of the election commissioner, Ashok Lavasa, get served an income tax notice, which is interesting because of the 3 election commissioners, he was the only one allegedly to have dissented from the EC's decision not to censure top BJP leaders.
Isn't it amazing how only people who are corrupt are the people who seem to sort of oppose the government? It's just a striking coincidence.
And so the plot thickens. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that story. Tanvi, Sadanand, great to have you back on the show. I hope to see you here again in about a month.
Adios, Milan.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Megan Maxwell and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.